Hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Brad. This is Q Branch Woodworks, and today I turned this huge ash bowl that weighs a little bit less than a pound. Stick around, I'll show you how it's done. So for today's turn, we're looking at this big piece of ash. As you can see here, as I've marked it out, looks like about 17 inches, maybe 5. So, pretty substantial chunk of wood. As always, the first order of business is just to knock down any corners or any edges that I don't want, resulting in an off-balance load when I put it on my lathe. This poor little bandsaw has really seen some stuff in its lifetime, and this will actually be the last project that I complete using this Craftsman bandsaw. It's just been run much harder than it was intended to. Next up, I affix a faceplate so that I can get this thing mounted on my lathe safely. I've actually never used the bed extension on my Laguna yet, and even though it took several months to get here, I'm excited to see what this expanded capability can do. This thing is right about at the swing capacity of the base lathe, so I decided to spin it freely over the extension portion. You'll notice that in the bottom of the blank there's a hole where I had initially tried to put a live center for a little bit of extra support, and things just were flexing a little bit too much for my liking, so I decided to take the opposite risk and try to turn it without the support of a live center. You'll notice me here standing very well out of the line of fire. The initial turnings on bowls like this often more closely resembles a fist fight than wood turning. Any point that's a little bit uneven can really beat you up, and you can see me using an overhand grip instead of my normal 3 fingers under, thumb on top to guide the bowl gouge through. The goal with this initial portion of the turning is just to remove anything that's off balance, so smoothing out the outside so you have a nice straight line, and then I like to knock back the bottom corner as well to remove mass, especially since I'm not turning with the support of a tailstock. The next thing I like to do on a bowl this size is to at least establish a chuck point. In this turning, I'm going to take a little bit more mass before I go ahead and reverse it, but I like to make sure that even if anything goes wrong, I still have a place where I can mount this thing to my lathe again. At this point, you can just start shaping the bowl as if it's any other bowl. You'll notice in the audio that there's a little bit of vibration coming through, so I'm not getting a perfectly clean cut here, but really the goal is just to remove as much mass as possible at this stage. Now that this is actually starting to look like a bowl, the next thing that I like to do is check my chuck and make sure that my tenon is the correct dimension. There's nothing worse than pulling the entire faceplate off only to find that you've missed the mark a little bit and have to remount it and return it. Turning bowls like this can be hard physical work, and this one's a little bit harder than usual, mostly because if I'm turning something this size under normal circumstances, I'll either leave it rough, leave 10% of the overall diameter in wall thickness so that I can allow it to dry and then return it later, or I'm going to be going back with a bowl coring system of some variety so that I can save a couple bowls from the interior. In this case, I'm going to be removing 98 to 99% of the material in this bowl, so it's a bit of a long haul. Now, as I started touching off the rim of the bowl there to get it even, I noticed that the bowl was a little bit off-center, so here I am retruing the outside of the bowl to make sure that I have nice even wall thickness all the way around. Now, the trick to getting the wall extra thin is that you can't do it all in one go. You can't core out most of the inside of the bowl and then go back and do one long cut on the inside, mostly because it's not supported through the interior anymore. So here I am using a light to cut the very top of the rim very thin. And then what I'll do is start pushing the inside of the bowl back a little bit at a time and cutting each section of the wall exactly this thin. As you can see here, I'm only exposing a little bit more of the outside wall every single time that I go back, and I'm trying to leave a lot of mass in the center because that acts as a damping force to make sure that the bowl walls don't flex and move as much as they would normally. Say, for instance, if I hollowed it all the way out, the walls would be wobbling all over the place. So the idea is to keep material where it's needed until you're ready to remove it. You can probably tell that I'm using my smaller 3/8 inch bowl gouge to do most of the fine work on the outside, and that's because A, I'm most comfortable with this bowl gouge, and B, it keeps me from taking a little bit too big of a bite. You can also start to see under the tool rest there, I'm using the light as a guide, and using the shade of light that's coming through the bowl as a way of determining just how thick that wall is, and I want that light tone to be nice and even all the way down the side. As I remove material from the inside of the bowl, I have less and less support through the middle of the bowl. So what I start to do with my left hand is to support the exact outside portion of the bowl that corresponds to where the bowl gouge is making its cut on the inside. This helps stop the wall from flexing away from the gouge and stops it from leaving those ripple marks that we often see on the inside of our thin bowls. It's worth noting that you need to keep a close eye on where the webbing of your outside hand is when you're making this kind of cut. Burns on the tips of your fingers are no fun, but I promise a burn on the webbing in between your thumb and index finger is even worse. I've never turned a bowl this big, this thin before, and one of the issues that I started running into was that my bowl gouge was hanging way out over the tool rest. I think one of my next investments, if I want to start doing this more regularly, will be a slightly longer tool rest so that I can get the rest closer to where I'm actually making the cuts on the interior. When you get to this point in the turn, slow and steady is the name of the game. You don't want to botch the piece here, and everything is vibrating so much that the only way to control it is just to hold your hands extra steady and make sure that you're spotting your exits of your cuts. As you can see, there are still some ridges left on the inside of this piece, but at this point I'm pretty happy with just how consistent the wall thickness is. And as you can see by the way that my hands are bending this thing pretty freely, it's fairly difficult to make any more cuts. I don't want to go back to the outside of the wall and try to cut anything because it'll definitely come apart. This is also where I start to get a little cocky and start thinking, how thin and how light can I actually make this thing? I go back and take a couple of passes with a negative rake scraper, and again you can see that left hand supporting the outside of the cut, making sure that the wall doesn't flex away from it. Be sure to put a fresh burr on your negative rake scraper if you're going to do this. You don't want something dull digging in. Power sanding at this stage isn't exactly futile, but it doesn't do as good a job as it would on a more stable bowl. I anticipate that from this point on there will be a lot more hand sanding involved in these thin bowls. Time to demount and see exactly what we have. Alright, you have to admit, that's pretty cool, right? At this point, I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to finish this foot, but I knew that at the very least I had to eliminate all of the marks left by the jaws. So I put my vacuum chuck on, centered this thing up, and just made one quick pass on the outside of the foot to true things up. Normally I would just rebate this foot slightly, but somewhere in here I started to think, wouldn't it be cool if this foot was as thin as the rest of the bowl? So I started hogging up material, being careful not to punch through in the center of the bowl. After taking a quick look at the bottom of the bowl, I realized that the curve wasn't exactly where I wanted it to be, and this is where I took probably the diciest cut of the entire turn, which was just smoothing out that curve. And I'm not ashamed to say that I let my 120 grit gouge do a little bit of the work for me there. Time to turn off the vacuum pump, give it a quick once over, maybe dust it off a little bit, and then we'll leave it for tomorrow to see how it dries. See you tomorrow. Sweet dreams. Final dimensions are, depending on how you look at it, 16.5 or, let's see here, 14.5. We'll call that 5.5, and you guys can ignore my knees cracking while I take this measurement. All right, the moment that we have all been waiting for. There we go. Boom, less than a pound. I'm quite happy, that was really close. Well, it just made it in under a pound, which I think is very cool. And as you can tell, after about 36 hours of drying, it's starting to warp pretty hard here. I think it still has some moisture to lose. I think if I were to leave this up for, I don't know, maybe another week or so, we'd probably see a weight closer to 14 ounces. I haven't decided what kind of finish I'm going to put on here yet. I think it's a nice and big enough piece that I may do something a little bit more labor intensive, like maybe some general bowl finishes or something like that. But I don't think that I could go wrong with something like a Walrus oil or a Danish oil as well. So yeah, pretty happy with how this bowl went overall. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot, and it makes sure that I can keep making videos for you every week. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one. I'm Brad, this is Q Branch Woodworks. You are awesome.